Most people think learning a language takes years. They think you need to live in another country. They think you need some kind of natural gift. None of that is true. Cleopatra spoke 9 languages. Not 2, not 3, 9. And she didn't learn them in a classroom. She didn't use flashcards. She didn't have a tutor drilling her on verb conjugations every morning. She learned them because she refused to use a translator. Every ambassador who came to her court, she spoke to them directly. In their own language: Egyptian, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopian, Persian, Parthian, Latin, Median. This wasn't a hobby. This was a strategic decision. And for 21 years, she ruled one of the most complex empires in the ancient world without a single interpreter standing between her and power. Now think about Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists who ever lived. In 1951, he was invited to teach at a university in Brazil. He didn't speak Portuguese. Most people in his position would bring a translator. Feynman didn't. Instead, months before the trip, he started listening to Brazilian music. He found native speakers and just talked to them. No textbook, no grammar rules, just sound and conversation. By the time he arrived in Rio, he was lecturing in Portuguese, not reading from a script, lecturing, answering questions, making jokes, in a language he didn't speak 1 year earlier. Then there's Benjamin Franklin. At 42 years old, Franklin decided to learn French, not because he had free time, because he was about to become America's most important diplomat. He didn't sign up for a class. He started reading French books, writing letters in French, having dinner with French speakers every chance he got. Then he did the same thing with Spanish, then Italian, then Latin. 4 languages learned after the age of 40, without a single formal lesson. And Ernest Hemingway. He lived in Paris and wrote in English, but he spoke French every day. He moved to Cuba and spoke Spanish with fishermen, bartenders, locals. He didn't study these languages. He lived inside them. When Hemingway spoke Spanish, he didn't sound like an American trying to speak Spanish. He sounded like someone who had become a different person. Because in a way, he had. Now, here's what most people miss. Cleopatra, Feynman, Franklin, Hemingway. None of them were linguists. None of them had a special talent for languages. And none of them followed the method that 90% of language learners use today. They didn't memorize vocabulary lists. They didn't study grammar tables. They didn't spend months preparing before they opened their mouth. They did something completely different. And what they did is something almost anyone can copy once you understand the system behind it. You've probably already noticed it. Every person we just talked about, Cleopatra, Feynman, Franklin, Hemingway, they all skipped the part most people think is essential, the studying part. They didn't treat language like a subject. They treated it like an environment. They didn't try to memorize a language. They tried to become someone who speaks it. That's not a small difference. That's the entire difference. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who won the Nobel Prize for his work on how humans think, explained something that makes this even clearer. He said the brain has 2 systems. System 2 is slow. It's the part of your brain that solves math problems, analyzes spreadsheets, and follows instructions step by step. System 1 is fast. It's the part that recognizes faces, catches a ball, and finishes a sentence before you even think about it. Here's the problem. Almost every language course in the world trains System 2. Grammar rules, vocabulary drills, flashcard apps, conjugation tables. But real language, the kind that lets you have a conversation, tell a joke, argue with someone, fall in love, that runs on System 1, you're training the wrong system. It's like learning to swim by reading a book about swimming. You understand the theory. You can name every stroke. But the moment you jump in the water, you panic. Because your body never learned it. Only your mind did. That's why someone can study a language for 5 years and still freeze when a native speaker talks to them. And that's why Feynman could lecture in Portuguese after a few months. He didn't train his analytical brain. He trained his instinct. Now, you might be thinking, does any of this still matter? We live in the age of AI. Google Translate is in your pocket. ChatGPT can write emails in 40 languages. Real-time translation earbuds already exist. So why bother learning a language at all? Here's why. Language is not just a communication tool. It's a thinking tool. Research from cognitive science shows that people who speak multiple languages don't just talk differently. They think differently. They notice different things. They solve problems from angles that monolingual people literally cannot see. A study published in Psychological Science found that bilingual people switch between cultural frames when they switch languages. They don't just change words. They change perspective. Cleopatra didn't speak 9 languages, so she could order food in 9 countries. She spoke 9 languages because each one gave her a different way to read people, negotiate, and control a room. If you only speak one language, you only have one lens, one filter, one way to process the world. AI can translate your words. It cannot translate your thinking. And in a world where everyone has access to the same tools, the same information, the same AI, the people who see the world through more than one frame will have an advantage that no algorithm can replicate. So the question is not whether you should learn a new language. The question is whether you can afford not to. So how do you actually do this? Not the textbook way. Not the way that fails 90% of people. The way that Cleopatra, Feynman, Franklin, and Hemingway did it, whether they knew it or not. There's a system behind it. And it starts with something most language learners get completely backwards. The first thing you need to do is stop speaking. That sounds wrong. Everyone tells you to start speaking from day one. Practice early, make mistakes, jump in. But think about how every human being on Earth actually learned their first language. You listened. For almost 2 years, you did nothing but listen. You absorbed sounds, rhythms, patterns. You didn't say a word. And then one day, you started talking, and it made sense. Stephen Krashen, a linguist who spent decades studying how people acquire language, called this the input hypothesis. His argument was simple. You don't learn a language by practicing output. You learn it by absorbing input, massive amounts of input. Feynman did exactly this before going to Brazil. He didn't practice speaking Portuguese in front of a mirror. He listened to Brazilian music. He sat in conversations he barely understood. He let the sound of the language soak into his brain before he ever tried to produce it. So, for your first 30 days with a new language, don't try to speak it. Listen to podcasts in that language. Watch films without subtitles. Play music in the background while you work. You won't understand most of it. That's fine. Your brain is mapping the sound system. It's doing work you can't feel yet. The second thing is to stop learning words one at a time. Most apps teach you isolated vocabulary. Apple, house, cat, run, beautiful. But nobody talks like that. Nobody walks into a room and says one word at a time. People speak in chunks, in phrases, in patterns. Linguist Polly and Sider published research showing that fluent speakers don't build sentences from scratch every time they talk. They pull from a mental library of ready-made phrases, what they called lexicalized sentence stems. When Feynman learned Portuguese, he didn't memorize the word for thank you by itself. He learned the whole phrase, muito obrigado foi prazer. That's thank you very much, it was a pleasure. One chunk, one rhythm, one memory. Franklin did something similar. He didn't sit with a French dictionary translating word by word. He read entire paragraphs in French. He let the phrases teach him the grammar, instead of the other way around. So instead of memorizing 200 individual words, learn 20 phrases you would actually use in a real conversation. Can I get the check, please? What do you recommend? I don't understand. Can you say that again? 20 phrases will get you further in a real conversation than 200 words ever will. The third thing is to build the environment before you build the skill. This is what Franklin understood better than almost anyone. He didn't just study French. He surrounded himself with it. French books on his desk, French letters in his mail, French conversations at his dinner table. He made it impossible to go through a day without touching the language. Hemingway did the same thing, but even more directly. He didn't wait until his Spanish was good enough to use it. His first day in a new city, he walked into a bar and ordered in the local language. Badly. But he did it. And that changed everything. Because once your environment runs on the new language, your brain has no choice but to adapt. You don't need to move to France to do this. Change the language on your phone. Switch your Netflix to the language you're learning. Find one person, just one, who speaks it, and talk to them for 15 minutes a week. The skill follows the environment, not the other way around. If you wait until you're ready, you'll never be ready. Build the environment first and let your brain catch up. The fourth thing is one that almost nobody wants to hear. You have to get comfortable being wrong, not just okay with it. Strategically wrong. Wrong on purpose. Kahneman's research on loss aversion shows that humans feel the pain of a loss about twice as strongly as the pleasure of a gain. That's why most language learners stay silent. The embarrassment of saying something wrong feels worse than the reward of getting it right. So they wait. They study more. They tell themselves they'll start speaking once they're ready. And that day never comes. Feynman had a completely different approach. When he lectured in Brazil, his Portuguese was full of mistakes. Wrong verb tenses, awkward pronunciation, sentences that didn't quite land. He didn't care. He kept going. And every mistake his brain made, it also corrected. Not because he studied the correction, because the reaction of the person in front of him told him instantly what worked and what didn't. That's how System 1 gets trained. Not through rules. Through feedback. Through thousands of small errors that quietly rewire your instinct. So instead of trying to be perfect, set a different goal. Try to make 10 mistakes a day. Real ones. In real conversations. Every mistake is a signal. And every signal is your brain recalibrating. The people who speak the worst in the beginning are usually the ones who speak the best in the end, because they started before they were ready. The fifth thing, and this is the one that separates people who learn a language from people who become fluent, is identity. Researchers Hong, Morris, Chu, and Benet Martinez studied something called cultural frame switching. What they found was that bilingual people don't just switch languages, they switch personalities. Their humor changes. Their body language changes. Even their values shift slightly, depending on which language they're speaking. Hemingway understood this instinctively. When he wrote in English, he was precise, controlled, economical. When he spoke French in Parisian cafes, he was looser, warmer, more playful. When he spoke Spanish in Havana, he was louder, more direct, more physical. He wasn't performing. He was becoming a different version of himself in each language. Cleopatra did the same thing at a far more strategic level. When she spoke Egyptian to her people, she wasn't just using their words. She was signaling that she was one of them. When she spoke Greek in court, she became the heir of Alexander's empire. Each language wasn't a tool she picked up. It was a self she stepped into. And that's the part most people never reach, because they're trying to add a language to who they already are, instead of letting the language create someone new. So when you start learning a new language, give yourself permission to change. Give yourself a different name in that language. Let your voice sit in a different place. Let your hands move differently. Let your personality shift. Because fluency doesn't come from knowing enough words. It comes from the moment you stop translating in your head and start thinking in the new language. And that only happens when you stop being a student of the language and start being a person who speaks it. Cleopatra didn't study 9 languages. She became 9 versions of herself. Feynman didn't memorize Portuguese. He turned himself into someone who thinks in Portuguese. Franklin didn't take French classes. He rebuilt his daily life until French was unavoidable. Hemingway didn't learn Spanish from a book. He let Spanish change the way he moved through the world. The real question was never how many languages you can learn. It's how many versions of yourself you're willing to become. Fluency isn't about talent. It's about who you become when you speak.